On July 27, 1918, a deafening explosion shook the Quiberon Peninsula in France, echoing for kilometers beyond the test range. A massive column of fire shot into the sky, and the shockwave leveled everything within hundreds of meters. When the smoke cleared, all that remained of the most powerful artillery piece in human history were twisted fragments of metal and scattered shards of its barrel. The gigantic 520mm howitzer, weighing 263 tons, had just destroyed itself during test firing. The 1,370-kilogram shell exploded right inside the barrel, turning the marvel of French engineering into a heap of useless scrap metal. But this was only the first tragedy in the story of this cursed weapon, which seemed to carry a dark fate within its steel frame. The story of this monster began much earlier, when the French military command made one of the most disastrous mistakes in its history. At the outbreak of World War I, French generals firmly believed in the doctrine of rapid offensives, bayonet charges, and swift victory over the enemy. They dreamed of glorious cavalry raids, imagining French infantry breaking through German lines with lightning attacks and marching triumphantly into Berlin. Heavy artillery seemed to them a relic of the past, cumbersome, slow, and an obstacle to the triumphant advance of the French army. Instead, they placed all their hopes on light, rapid-fire guns, especially the famous 75mm cannon, affectionately nicknamed Mademoiselle 75 by the soldiers. The reality of war turned out to be brutal and merciless. By the end of 1914, it became clear that there would be no rapid advance. The Western Front had turned into an unbroken line of trenches stretching from the North Sea to the Swiss border. Armies dug ever deeper, building increasingly complex fortifications of concrete and steel. The light French guns proved almost useless against the powerful German fortifications. The Germans, from the very beginning, had invested in heavy artillery, and now methodically crushed French positions under the fire of their massive cannons. The French command, panicked, finally realized the scale of its mistake as German shells reduced entire sections of the front to rubble, burying thousands of soldiers beneath. Thus began a frantic race to create ever more powerful artillery systems. France made a strategic decision to focus on railway-mounted guns, a brilliant move that provided huge advantages over traditional towed artillery. Rail transport made it possible to bring super-heavy howitzers directly to the front lines, regardless of road conditions, mud, or weather. And if there was no railway nearby, it could simply be built anew. Trench warfare provided plenty of time for that. The Schneider Company and its competitors launched a full-scale arms race, developing an entire series of railway artillery systems ranging from 164 to 370 millimeters. Many of them were based on naval guns, adapted for land warfare. One company in particular, St. Chamond, stood out, with its engineers designing a 400mm gun that demonstrated stunning effectiveness. In late October 1916, near Verdun, this weapon performed a true miracle. The Germans had captured the powerful Fort Douaumont, turning it into an impregnable fortress. The French command hurled regiment after regiment at it, but all efforts were in vain. Then, the 400mm howitzer was brought forward. It took only 2 shots for its 650-kilogram shells to. The shells turned part of the fortifications into a heap of ruins. The Germans fled in panic, abandoning their positions and the entire nearby sector of the front. It was a triumph of heavy artillery that made the French High Command reconsider building an even more powerful weapon. On January 24, 1916, the Schneider Company received an order that would change the history of artillery. The French military demanded 2 super-powerful railway howitzers of 520mm caliber. They were intended to be absolute weapons of retribution, capable of destroying any enemy fortification with a single shot. The engineers at Schneider faced a task that proved nearly impossible. They had to create an artillery system of a caliber for which no precedent existed. Whereas earlier projects could use existing naval guns adapted for railway platforms, such a trick would not work for a 520mm howitzer. Neither the French Navy nor the Army had guns of that caliber in service. Everything had to be developed from absolute scratch, from the barrel to the loading system. Every component of this gigantic mechanism required the most meticulous calculations and engineering solutions never before attempted. Work on the project stretched for more than a year. Engineers wrestled with every detail, fully aware that the smallest miscalculation could lead to catastrophe. The barrel, 11.9 m long, equal to 15 calibers, weighed 44 tons. It was a solid steel structure designed to withstand the monstrous gas pressures of firing. The overall length of the railway platform with the mounted gun exceeded 30 m. Under this behemoth were two paired four-axle wheel bogies intended to distribute the incredible weight across the rails. The total mass of the entire assembly reached 263 tons, making this howitzer one of the heaviest artillery pieces ever built by man. One of the main problems was the aiming system. The gun could change elevation from 20° to 60°, allowing it to fire high-arcing shots at enemy fortifications. But horizontal aiming traverse was a real nightmare for the engineers. It was impossible to build a rotating platform that could both bear such mass and provide precise horizontal aiming. So the French came up with an original solution. To aim horizontally, the entire 263-ton behemoth had to be moved along specially laid curved railway tracks. This required colossal preparatory work at every firing position, but there was simply no alternative. The loading process became an extremely complex technical operation. To load the gun, the barrel had to be lowered to a strictly horizontal position. Then a special electrically driven mechanism fed the shell into the breech. Imagine the effort required to lift and feed shells weighing from 1,370 to 1,654 kilograms. It was absolutely impossible by human power alone. That is why the engineers developed an entire system of electric mechanisms to service the howitzer. A separate railway wagon with a powerful electric generator producing 103 kilowatts was needed to power all this equipment. Without it, the gun turned into a useless hulk of metal. Loading was separate, which made the process even more complicated. First, the shell was sent into the barrel, then the powder charge. Two types of high-explosive ammunition were used. The lighter shells, weighing 1,370 kilograms, reached a muzzle velocity of 500 meters per second and could strike targets at ranges up to 17 kilometers. The heavy concrete piercing projectiles, weighing 1,654 kilograms, were intended to demolish the strongest fortifications. They accelerated to 430 meters per second, but their range was limited to 14.5 kilometers. The entire reloading process took at least 5 minutes, making the howitzer's rate of fire extremely low. Preparing a firing position became a true engineering operation that took several days. Ordinary railway tracks simply could not withstand such monstrous loads. Additional sleepers had to be laid to reinforce the foundation. Massive steel beams were then placed on the rails to distribute the weapon's weight over a larger area. 7 supports of the railway mounting were lowered onto those beams using special screw jacks. 5 supports were positioned under the middle part of the platform, directly beneath the gun where the main load concentrated. 2 more supports rested under the balancing members of the running gear. This whole system had to ensure stability at firing, when the recoil from launching a 1.5-ton shell produced colossal stresses on the structure. The first howitzer was ready by November 11, 1917. Its assembly took nearly 2 years from the moment the order was placed. The second mounting was completed by March 7, 1918. The French command decided to hold large-scale trials with press attendance, a carefully calculated propaganda move. On one hand, the French wanted to raise the morale of their own troops by showing they possessed an absolute weapon against German fortifications. On the other hand, newspaper reports were meant to demoralize the enemy, forcing the Germans to realize that the French had acquired a weapon of monstrous destructive power. Tests began in February 1918 and continued into March. Journalists enthusiastically described every shot fired by the monster, calculating how many tons of explosives one such howitzer could hurl onto German positions. Photographs of the giant gun appeared in all the major French newspapers. It seemed that at last France had obtained a weapon that would turn the tide of the war. But fate had a very different future in store for this weapon than the French generals and enthusiastic journalists had imagined. On July 27, 1918, a new group of military observers and press representatives gathered at the Quiberon Peninsula test range. The day was clear and windless, ideal for firing trials. The first howitzer, which had already successfully completed several test series, was preparing for another shot. The crew had finished all preparatory operations. The shell had been loaded, and the powder charge sent after it. None of those present could even imagine that a few seconds later they would witness a catastrophe that would forever enter the history of artillery as one of the most terrible incidents. The crew commander gave the order to fire. A deafening roar sounded, but instead of flying out of the barrel toward the target, the shell weighing 370 kilograms exploded right inside the bore. The blast wave ripped the 44-ton barrel open like a tin can. Gigantic steel fragments flew in all directions, becoming deadly shrapnel. A fireball rose above the range, followed by secondary explosions of ammunition and fuel. The railway platform deformed under the monstrous force of the blast. The loading mechanisms were reduced to a shapeless heap of twisted metal. In a matter of seconds, there was nothing left of the most powerful gun in the French army but smoking wreckage scattered across the test ground. The investigation commission was never able to determine the exact cause of the shell bursting inside the barrel. Perhaps it was a manufacturing defect in the ammunition. Perhaps the problem lay in the barrel's construction, or perhaps a fatal combination of several factors played a role. But the result was obvious and dreadful. France lost half of its arsenal of super-heavy howitzers before any of them had fired on the enemy. 2 years of the engineers' most intense labor, colossal financial expenditures, the hopes of the high command, all turned to smoke and ash in an instant. The second howitzer had by that time already completed its trials and was in the arsenal. After the Quiberon tragedy, the military command faced a difficult choice. On the one hand, the weapon had demonstrated incredible destructive power during successful firings. On the other hand, the catastrophe showed that the design might conceal fatal flaws. Long councils and debates began over whether it was worth risking the only remaining mounting. While the French generals discussed the howitzer's fate, the war inexorably moved toward its end. On November 11, 1918, in the forest of Compiègne, an armistice was signed between Germany and the Allied powers. The First World War had ended, and the most powerful gun ever created. To crush German fortifications never fired a single combat shot. The unique howitzer was first sent for storage in Le Creusot, and later to a specially built arsenal for heavy railway artillery. In the city of Neuvy-Palus, there, spare barrels made for both units were stored, along with massive stockpiles of ammunition and generating substations, necessary to power the weapon's electrical systems. Throughout the 1920s, this gun remained a kind of star of French military propaganda. Photographs of the giant howitzer regularly appeared in newspapers and magazines. Military commentators wrote articles about the incredible power of this weapon, capable of destroying an entire city block with a single shot, or reducing the strongest fortress to ruins. The howitzer became a symbol of French military strength, a source of national pride. Foreign military delegations traveled specifically to the arsenal in Neuvy-Palus to witness this marvel of engineering with their own eyes. Yet despite all this attention, the weapon continued to rest peacefully on its railway platform, never once firing at a real enemy. The situation changed dramatically in the spring of 1940, when German forces launched their offensive against France. The blitzkrieg unfolded with a speed no one had foreseen. German tank columns broke through French defenses one after another, advancing rapidly deep into the country. The French army, which had prepared for a repeat of the positional warfare of the First World War, was completely unprepared for the new tactics of lightning war. The Maginot Line, whose construction had taken years and enormous sums, was simply bypassed by German troops through Belgium. The French command was thrown into panic, desperately trying to organize some kind of resistance, but the German advance was so swift that all attempts to create a stable defensive line failed one after another. Amid this chaos, retreat, and destruction, no one even remembered the giant howitzer, resting at the arsenal in Neuvy-Palus. To prepare this gun for combat required weeks of preparatory work. Rail tracks had to be laid to the intended firing position, the roadbed reinforced, supports installed, the generator wagon hauled up, and ammunition delivered. But the pace of the German advance made any such preparations utterly pointless. By the time the howitzer would have been ready to fire, the front line would already have moved far beyond it, leaving the weapon deep in enemy rear. On June 22, 1940, France capitulated. German forces seized the arsenal at Neuvy-Palus along with all its contents. Among the trophies was the legendary 520mm howitzer, still fully serviceable. The Germans could hardly believe their luck. They had gained at their disposal the most powerful artillery piece the French had never used against them. The German High Command designated the captured howitzers 52 cm howitzer E.871 French. German engineers thoroughly examined the captured weapon, inspected every mechanism and system. To their surprise, despite over 20 years of storage, the howitzer was in excellent technical condition. The French had clearly cared for their creation carefully, performing regular maintenance. Along with the gun, the Germans acquired spare barrels, an impressive stockpile of ammunition, and all necessary equipment to deploy a firing position. It was truly a royal prize, a potential trump card for the German army. In the summer and autumn of 1940, preparations began to transport the howitzer to the Eastern Front. The Germans understood that such a weapon could prove invaluable during sieges of large cities and assaults on powerful fortifications. Shipping the 263-ton monster across occupied Europe required meticulous planning. Bridges along the route had to be checked for strength, rails verified to bear the load, and security organized for the entire route. The slightest mistake could lead to catastrophe and the loss of the unique weapon. By the summer of 1941, when German forces smashed into the Soviet Union, the French howitzer was still on the move. The Wehrmacht's rapid advances created the illusion that the war would be won in months. German tank groups punched through Soviet defenses, encircled and destroyed entire armies, and seized vast territories. By September, units of Army Group North reached the approaches to Leningrad and began preparing to capture the city. Hitler ordered that Leningrad not be stormed but taken by starvation, by blocking all supply routes and methodically destroying the city with artillery fire. It was for this purpose that the German command decided to use the captured French super-heavy howitzer. In late October 1941, the gun finally arrived near Leningrad. The Germans chose a position that allowed them to target key points in the city. Meticulous work began to prepare the firing site. German sappers laid additional railway spurs, reinforced the roadbed with steel beams, and installed supports under the massive platform. At the same time, ammunition was prepared and auxiliary equipment deployed. The generator wagon was positioned beside the howitzer, power cables were run to the electric loading mechanisms. All this took place under the constant threat of Soviet air raids and counter-battery fire. The German artillerymen assigned to operate the trophy weapon underwent special training. They had to study the French technical documentation, master unfamiliar control mechanisms, and learn the correct sequence of actions for loading and aiming. It was nothing like the German artillery systems they were used to. Every operation required strict adherence to instructions and precise coordination by the entire crew. A mistake could cost the lives of the gunners and could damage the unique weapon. By early November, the preparations were complete. The howitzer took its firing position and was ready to begin shelling Leningrad. The German command pinned great hopes on it. The 1.5-ton shells were expected to wreak destruction in the city, destroy industrial facilities, disrupt communications and infrastructure, and demoralize defenders and civilians. Of special interest were the 654 kg concrete-piercing projectiles, capable of penetrating the most powerful shelters and reinforced concrete structures. The Germans planned to methodically destroy one target after another, turning Leningrad into a pile of rubble. The first shots were fired in November. The massive shells flew out from the positions, covering several kilometers, and slammed into the city. Explosions from the 1.5-ton rounds created craters the size of a small house, destroying everything within tens of meters. The shock wave shattered windows hundreds of meters from the blast epicenter. Fragments flew vast distances, becoming a deadly hail of metal. Each hit was a catastrophe for the neighborhood struck, but the gun's low rate of fire severely limited its effectiveness. One shot every 5 minutes meant the howitzer could fire at most 12 rounds per hour under ideal conditions, and in practice the rate was even lower. Each time after a shot, time was needed to inspect the barrel, check the mechanisms, and prepare the next shell. Moreover, the loading process itself was a complex, multi-stage operation. The barrel had to be lowered to a horizontal position. Electric mechanisms then moved the massive shell to the breech. After that, the powder charge was loaded, and the barrel was raised to the required elevation angle. Soviet forces quickly detected the position of the German super-heavy howitzer. Counter-battery units began firing back, attempting to destroy or at least damage the weapon. The Germans had to build protective structures around the gun, camouflage the position, and remain constantly alert. Soviet aircraft also tried to bomb the artillery, but the reliable protection of anti-aircraft guns and Luftwaffe fighters made such raids extremely dangerous and largely ineffective. December 1941 was particularly harsh. Temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius, creating additional difficulties for the howitzer crew. Mechanisms froze, lubricants thickened, and every operation required far more time and effort, yet the shelling continued. The Germans methodically fired at pre-selected targets, aiming to inflict maximum damage on the city's defenses. On January 3, 1942, a cold, clear day, the German crew prepared for another bombardment of Leningrad's positions. All operations had been practiced to perfection over the previous weeks of combat. The 370 kg shell was lifted by the electric mechanism and sent into the barrel, followed by the powder charge. The barrel slowly rose to the designated elevation angle. The crew commander gave the order to fire, and at that moment, something happened that no one present could have predicted. The shell exploded inside the barrel, just as it had 24 years earlier at the French test range in Quiberon. The powerful blast tore the 44-ton barrel apart. A fireball rose over the position, and metal fragments flew in all directions. The railway platform deformed under the monstrous force of the explosion. The loading mechanisms were reduced to a heap of twisted metal. The second and final 520 mm howitzer repeated the fate of its sister, destroying itself with its own shell. The Germans were in shock. The unique weapon, intended to be a key asset in the siege of Leningrad, had become a useless heap of scrap metal. It was beyond repair. The damage was fatal. The remnants of the gun remained in place until Soviet forces discovered them in 1944, while liberating Leningrad's territory from the occupiers. Thus ended the story of the most powerful artillery piece of the First World War, which twice perished by its own shells and never realized its destructive potential. This weapon became a symbol of how ambitious engineering projects can turn into complete failures. The pursuit of maximum power sometimes produces monsters unable to control their own destructive force. If you enjoyed this story about the legendary French gun, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Write in the comments which military equipment you'd like to see in future episodes. Your support is crucial for creating new and interesting content.